just give up. Nothing's going to make me look good. All right, so today what we're going to be doing is talking about chemical bonding, okay? Or the idea of taking all these elements that we've been looking at on the periodic table and creating larger, more complex things that have different properties to them that we can utilize for different things, whether it's us using them for some kind of purpose at home, like making a thing like nail polish or something like that, or if we're doing something chemically inside of our bodies in order to carry out all of these functions, like what's necessary for your brain to understand and comprehend the things that I'm about to address. So in this video, what I want to do is introduce what chemical bonding is, what it means, what kind of things you can form, and introduce the two different kinds that we're going to be the two different kinds of chemical bonding we're going to be focusing on before we talk about those more specifically in their own videos. Okay? So let's begin by just talking about what a chemical bond is. So a chemical bond, you can think about a chemical bond as a force, right? So we know what forces are, we know what forces do, right? Forces are pushes and pulls, right? Things that either bring things together or push them apart. But essentially a chemical bond is a force that holds together two or more atoms that creates a stable substance. Okay. And so I'm going to put some air quotes and underline the idea of stable, but here the idea is that when you form a chemical bond, generally you create something that's going to be more stable and long-lasting than, say, the parts together. So essentially you're making something that's more functional or differently functional than the parts that it composes, right? So when we're talking about chemical bonds, the general product that you're going to be making from any kind of chemical bond is you're going to be forming a compound. So when we're talking about making new things, we're going to be using a few different terms, right? One of them is compound, the other one we might be using is molecule. And we'll talk about when it's appropriate to use those terms. But basically a compound is when you have two or more a substance, and by substance that can be solid, liquid, gas, something metal, whatever, a substance that's made up of combining two or more different elements. And when I say here two or more different elements, right, if we're going to be creating a compound, what we're going to be doing is putting together different things from parts of the periodic table, okay, in order to create a new substance. All right, another term you might see is a molecule, okay. So a molecule is like the basic unit of a substance that has its properties. Okay, so like if we're talking about a basic substance, like let's say sand, for example. Sand is actually a mixture of silicon and oxygen. So silicon we know, there's a G in oxygen. With silicon we know that it's kind of this brittle, sort of shiny semiconductor, and we know that oxygen is this clear, odorless gas, right? But when the two come together, they create a compound that is going to be, brittle, right? Brown in color, gray in color, okay? That, has the general characteristics of sand, right? So if we're talking about the basic molecule of forming this, right? Silicon and oxygen, right? This is just the shorthand model for writing those things, the symbols, right? What we're talking about here is just the basic molecule. So like one silicon molecule would be one of Si with two oxygens put together to form the compound, okay? When we're talking about our formation of a molecule, the other thing to keep in mind is that you can make a molecule with only one type of atom. So if you all take a deep breath right now, there are a few molecules that you all just breathed in that contain just a molecule that is of one single element. So for example, when you're thinking about the oxygen that you need to carry out your bodily functions, or the oxygen that you are doing and breathing in is actually two oxygen atoms put together to create one thing that we call molecular oxygen. And there are several, I can't spell oxygen. There are several different forms of this, different elements. Another one that you guys just all breathed in was nitrogen. Nitrogen likes to form a bond with itself. And again, the whole reason for doing that is to create a substance that's more stable. We know that oxygen really likes electrons, right? But if it can share electrons with another molecule of itself that is around, it's going to do it, right? And that's just to make it more stable overall, okay? So again, chemical bonds, you're forming compounds, right? And then with those compounds, you're creating something greater than, the parts that make it up. So let's look at our periodic table here and talk about what kind of compound and kind of things that we can make, right? So let's just identify a few different parts of our periodic table. We know that over here, generally, we're going to have our non-metals. Over here on this side, right, kind of where our line is for our metalloids, right, that are going to be right here, okay? Over here, we're going to have our metals. So when we're forming different compounds, they're going to be formed from taking different parts of the periodic table and putting those elements together, okay? One thing to note here is that hydrogen can behave both as a metal and a non-metal, right? So you can think of hydrogen as being there, or you can put hydrogen in this box here to be functional for what we're going to do. Hydrogen can kind of do both, right? So if, for example, we were taking two non-metals and putting them together, generally, we're going to be making a compound that is called a covalent compound. And this is going to be made through a covalent bond. If we say take a non-metal and a metal together, generally what those are going to be forming is going to be an ionic compound. Okay. So, and those are going to be formed through an ionic bond. Okay. So, again, when we're looking at these compounds, kind of the first step that we want to do is look at where those elements are located on the periodic table. And that's going to be a really good indicator of what kind of bond you're going to be dealing with and what rules you're going to need to follow as we're either defining what that element, what that compound is, what it's made up of, and how we're going to draw it structurally. Like, what is a molecule going to look like of that particular thing? Okay. Ooh, don't want to see my face. I already thought that's scary. All right, so what we're going to be addressing in our next videos is we're going to be diving a little bit more into the specifics of what's happening with a covalent bond and with an ionic bond, okay, and how those individual things are going to be handled, okay? So if you've got questions about the basics of bonding, really the thing that we need to know and remember is that a chemical bond is just where we use a force to bring together two different elements or two of the same element together to create some kind of substance that's going to have individual properties, right? And that we call those compounds, right? A compound is if we have two or more different elements that are put together to create something. And then a molecule is just the basic unit of something that has its individual properties, right? That shows what it is. It's very similar to the idea of what we have with a element, right? Molecules are just like the element of that compound, okay? So if you've got individual questions or more you want to know, you can always hit me up.